So my name is Brian Shriver. I am the volunteer director of the Northeast chapter of All Aboard Ohio, our passenger rail advocacy organization. This evening, I'm going to be talking a little bit about North Carolina passenger rail program because I think it's an excellent model for Ohio to pursue. There are quite a few similarities, and the main thing is that they are showing us what a successful passenger rail program could look like. And I will also make the argument that Ohio's really got a stronger business case than what they have in North Carolina. So if North Carolina has been able to be successful with that program, I think it shows that we can really have a lot of success here in Ohio. So thank you all very much for joining us this evening. I really appreciate your time. I know we're all busy folks and got a lot of different things going. So thank you very much for your time this evening. And I will go ahead and share my screen here. We'll see how much Zoom wants to cooperate with me this evening, but hopefully I'll have some luck here. Okay, what I really want to do is start my presentation and then try that again. Okay, so
it's ideal, but if that's the case, it's gonna be there.
Okay, share screen.
That's not where it goes, man.
Oh, Zoom every time, such a joy. Okay, let me try and get your faces back up here because Zoom thinks it knows what I want and it most certainly does not. Okay, now I can see everyone again and I can see my slides. So if I could get a thumbs up, if you could see my slides, that would be wonderful. Awesome, thank you. Right, so as I mentioned, I think that North Carolina is a great example for Ohio in terms of passenger rail, and North Carolina is having great success with their passenger rail program. So I want to talk about how there are a number of similarities in how Ohio actually has a stronger business case. So that's kind of the purpose of, hey, why are we talking about North Carolina here? I'd love to call everyone's attention to my new background. I had a friend of mine, I think a lot of you are familiar with the there's an old passenger rail promo shot with a New York Central train and an old Cleveland transportation system rapid on it. So I had them recreate it with a modern Cleveland skyline in the background as just a reminder of what we're aspiring to here. So anyway, we can see the presentation. I'm happy to see it's not auto advancing. I never know what kind of adventures I'm going to get into as I move things around here on computers. But anyway, let's talk a little bit about this, right? So this is the Northeast chapter. All Aboard Ohio is a statewide passenger rail advocacy organization, and I appreciate spending some of your evening with me today. So we're going to talk a little bit about this North Carolina passenger rail and what they're doing in North Carolina. I think North Carolina is an excellent example of a successful Amtrak service. This is a map of North Carolina, kind of giving you a feel for what the service is today. When we look at North Carolina, it does have several long distance services that go through it north to south, but really the core of North Carolina's passenger rail is the Piedmont corridor that connects Charlotte, if you're able to see my cursor, Charlotte and Greensboro, and then the Raleigh-Durham area, which are the three largest metro areas in the state of North Carolina. Their FY23 ridership in North Carolina was 1.15 million. So nearly 10x Ohio's 134,000 Amtrak riders. We haven't seen the station by station ridership numbers in FY24, but based on the Piedmont being up 24% in FY24 compared to 23, and the Carolinian being up 10 or so percent, I am estimating that North Carolina will have seen 10 times the ridership in FY24 compared to Ohio. So that's what we're looking at here. And really, this is built around the core of service on that Piedmont corridor connecting the three largest metro areas because there are 5 daily trains each direction along that core Piedmont route. Okay, so and those, again, as I mentioned, are the 3 largest metro areas in North Carolina. And the lighter lines on this map are some of the north-south lines. So you can now get on a train in Ohio and go to North Carolina because the Floridian does pass through North Carolina if someone is so inclined. That is definitely a slow way to get there. Okay, so moving right along, if PowerPoint cooperates and Zoom, um, when we look at the history of modern passenger rail in North Carolina, that's kind of what sets our roadmap up for Ohio. So if we go back to the early 90s, there were several Amtrak long distance services that were going north-south through North Carolina. Now you all just saw the map. Their core areas are kind of along that crescent east-west corridor. So none of those long distance services did a good job of in-state connections. So in 1990, the modern Carolinian service was established. And so that was from Charlotte through Greensboro to Raleigh in state, and then hit a few more cities, smaller cities in North Carolina, and then went north to Richmond, Virginia, and on to Washington, D.C., and then on the Northeast corridor up into New York City. So that was established as a typical, one train each way per day in 1990. Now, North Carolina wanted to complement that service because, as you're all aware, if there's only one train, you can't really make a day trip. So the idea of the Piedmont service was to complement the Carolinian and do those in the in-state route. So essentially having a Raleigh, Greensboro, Charlotte train, so that if you wanted to do a day trip in either direction, you could, right? You could get on a train in Raleigh in the morning, go to Charlotte, and in the evening come back to Raleigh. And then similarly, if you were in Charlotte, you could take the Carolinian in the morning, get yourself to Raleigh, take care of some things in the state capital, and then take an evening train back to Charlotte. Now, one of the things I really think it's important to emphasize is that when that service started, it wasn't particularly good in terms of speed or reliability. There were sections of it that were, limited to 30 miles an hour based on track conditions. There were frequently, freight trains holding up, so the reliability wasn't necessarily that great, but there were still enough people riding it to start to, generate interest. And so the state of North Carolina noticed that, and they continued to invest in it over time. And not ancient history. I mean, there's, I'll talk about it here on the next slide, but a lot of the additional frequency that they have today has been added over the last 15 years. Okay. But I think it's really important. A lot of times we hear back, oh, is this new service that we're talking about, is it going to be high-speed rail, or is it going to be slow? Is it going to have a lot of freight interference? And I mean, if we don't spend enough, yes, all of those problems will be there. And I still think it would be worthwhile to do because there is going to be a chunk of potential ridership who will ride it. Yes, the faster it is, the more people will ride it. Yes, the more reliable it is, the more people will ride it. But even a baseline service that isn't particularly fast is still useful to a chunk of people that are trying to get around the state. So North Carolina then continued to invest. And as there were opportunities of federal funding that would come along, North Carolina would submit and would get grants. And so the second daily Piedmont was only added in 2010, right? So only 15 years ago, and after 15 years of service on that route. So now, in combination with the Carolinian, you had 3 trains each day making the connection between those core cities. And this is a little bit more zoomed in map of that North Carolina service with Charlotte and then Greensboro and then the Raleigh Durham area, Raleigh being the state capital. And then in just 2018, so again, not all that long ago, a third daily Piedmont was added and the new Raleigh Union Station opened, right? So they have a nice new modern train station in Raleigh. Now, of course, like everything else, a lot of things got interrupted and suspended and things like that during COVID. But then in 2023, with continued reinvestment, they were adding a fourth daily Piedmont, right? So now you've got 5 trains a day in each direction once you add in the Carolinian on that core Piedmont service. There are ongoing investments now to add a fifth daily Piedmont, so getting us to 6 trains a day each direction. And there are ongoing speed and reliability investments. And then in Charlotte, where they have made some rail investments, and they have like a local streetcar and local light rail line. They are also under development of a brand new Charlotte Gateway multimodal station. So that's kind of in the planning phases. The streetcar is there now; they're starting to do development, but essentially it's a better location, and then obviously a modern station for it as well. So that's kind of the Carolina in-state service, and part of why they're having a lot of success with it. They're continuing to invest. Now, I want to emphasize, I mean, I know we've got a lot of very knowledgeable railroad folks on here, but we also have some folks that are probably just trying to learn some of these things. This is a shared corridor, right? So there is freight service and freight trains on this. I believe Norfolk Southern is running, is the primary Class 1 freight railroad on this. Now, one distinction here, though, is that in North Carolina, it is the state of North Carolina that owns the railroad infrastructure, and Norfolk Southern is providing service in a leasing arrangement. So that does give them some advantages in terms of like, hey, this is how we're going to divvy up time slots in that. But yes, this is a shared corridor. Yes, there is freight trains on here. So today, to my knowledge, the highest speed sections are running at 79 miles an hour. With these new and future investments, they are expecting to have some sections be able to go faster than that for passenger rail. Okay, so moving right along here. When we look at the Piedmont slash Carolinian, the ridership growth has really been astronomical, especially the last couple of years. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, the Piedmont service saw 24.5% increase from fiscal year 23 to fiscal year 24. So that would be their fiscal year is October through September, right? So fiscal year 24 is the year that ended roughly 6 months ago, in September. And that was building off of the previous year. They had seen 36% ridership growth on them. Okay. A little bit of that ridership, a chunk of that ridership growth is because they were re-adding service that had been suspended because of COVID. And then they added an additional new train. So that's driven a lot. As there are more trains each direction a day, it becomes more useful to more people. So they've made incremental speed improvements over the last 35 years. And then adding frequency makes it convenient to more people. So these are all-time ridership records. And they have really gotten the interest of the North Carolina Department of Transportation. And so it enjoys broad bipartisan support in North Carolina, as far as a service and a meaningful part of their transportation system in the state. Now, with the Corridor ID program, which was the main opportunity for state-supported rail service getting additional investment from the federal government through the infrastructure bill from a few years ago. North Carolina submitted for 12 corridors through that program, and they were awarded 7, right? And so again, by comparison, Ohio essentially had 3, a fourth if you want to count Amtrak's submission for the service that goes through Cincinnati, long distance service. But North Carolina now has these 7 different routes being studied, from grants from the federal government. You can kind of see on the map here some of the things they're talking about doing, getting the train over to the mountains of Western North Carolina into Asheville. Getting a little extension service to get from Greensboro into Winston-Salem, which is kind of, next door there. And then improving service to the cities in the Southeast, right? So Fayetteville is a big military base and city there, and then Wilmington being the larger city on the Southeast coast of North Carolina. And then the biggest investment happening is right now, if you kind of follow my cursor here, once you get to Raleigh, if you're on the Carolinian, you actually dip down to the southeast a little more through Selma, and then curving through Wilson, Rocky Mount, and this. It's not a particularly direct route for getting to Richmond and then DC. So there is a new proposed corridor from Raleigh to Richmond that, if fully implemented, is going to cut an hour off the time between those cities. So anybody trying to get to Richmond or to DC or to New York City is going to save an hour. It's called the S line. It's essentially an underutilized or not used freight corridor. So existing right of way, but they'll need to build from scratch the track and things like that. So they got a $1 billion grant for the first and most expensive portion of this, which is getting from Raleigh to the town of Wake Forest on the north side of Raleigh. So that's this S-Line project. So essentially just a reflection of, hey, when you take passenger rail seriously, then when there are opportunities for additional funding that come up, well, now that means that the federal government considers you a good partner for additional rail investments and has recognized that. So, North Carolina is getting quite a bit more investment and potential additional passenger rail service there. Okay. Now, I want to paint this picture about how North Carolina really provides us this model for Ohio. So we've got the map of Ohio, the map of North Carolina. Those are on approximately the same scale here, right? So just, if you're not familiar with the geography of it, I want to make sure everybody's got this. That Piedmont corridor that we have been discussing, that's about 173 miles. Now, the Ohio 3C and D, which is proposed and would connect Cleveland to Columbus to Dayton to Cincinnati, that is 260 miles, right? So in the same ballpark, is longer, but in the same ballpark. And one of the things I think is important is that even though the route is longer, when we look at North Carolina, Raleigh is the state capital. That is all the way at the eastern end of this Piedmont corridor, right? So by comparison, when we look at Columbus, I think the state capital is going to generate more trips maybe than a similar sized city. And so, Columbus is a shorter distance from any other point on the Ohio 3C and D than it is from Charlotte to Raleigh, as an example. So I wanted to talk a little bit about like these similarities, right? So in North Carolina, we're talking about connecting the three largest metros. In Ohio, when we connect the three Cs in Dayton, that's the four largest metro areas in Ohio. Now, in North Carolina, the population served, so in other words, the total population of the metro areas that Piedmont service connects is 5.6 million people. By comparison, the metro areas that would be connected on the Ohio 3C and D is 7.6 million people, right? So when we look at the four large cities, and then also Mansfield adding another 140,000, Springfield adding another 130,000, we're serving a huge percentage of the population, right? So, more than 2/3 of Ohio's population and then 7.6 million people. So when sometimes you get pushback of like, hey, do we really have the density? Do we have enough people? Yes, absolutely. We're talking about connecting 7.5 million people. So again, pointing out here that the state capital is in the middle of the 3C and D route by comparison to Carolina, where it's at the far eastern end. So that's kind of like, I just wanted to paint this picture and show like, hey, how similar these things are. The other reason that I think there's a lot of similarities in the service provided is that when we look at maybe some other Amtrak services around the country that are successful. As an example, there is a wonderful service connecting Milwaukee and Chicago, and that train goes about 7 or 8 times a day. And everybody in Milwaukee knows if you're going to Chicago, that you take the Amtrak Hiawatha train. But I think just in terms of when we're trying to convince people that aren't sold on passenger rail yet, they might toss that off and say, well, yeah, Chicago, nobody wants to drive in Chicago. Obviously, taking a train makes sense there. And kind of similarly in Virginia, a lot of Virginia's passenger rail program at least started with better ways to get to DC. And I think the same thing there. People say, hey, well, obviously nobody wants to drive in DC, so it makes sense to take the train. In North Carolina, that's not the case. In North Carolina, this is connecting big, sprawly southeastern cities. There's not like some massive metro area that is going to scare drivers off and cost $50 a day to park. We're talking about Charlotte and Greensboro and Raleigh, sprawly southeastern cities, and not necessarily particularly strong public transit in any of those cities either. I mean, Charlotte has gotten a lot better in the last 25 years, but not particularly strong public transit in any of those cities either. So there's a lot of similarities in terms of the cities that we are connecting between and propose to connect with the Ohio 3C and D, um, when we look at North Carolina as an example, this is a service for a person who wants to get on the train in Greensboro with 800 or 900,000 people living in that city. It's only 80 miles from Greensboro to Raleigh, but it's still a popular service to use because it gets you right to the downtown. It gets you close to the things you need to do in Raleigh. You can make a day trip out of it, and you don't have to worry about driving, competing with other drivers on the highway, risking getting into a car crash, or maybe you just want to take a nap on the way, or you want to get some work done on your laptop on the way. And when we have a passenger rail option, we're able to do that. And so it's proven to be a very successful service. And so Ken is posting in the chat some of the pre-pandemic ridership numbers. And again, when you look at those, the growth to today, there's substantially more ridership on these services today than there was even in a pre-pandemic area. So what I've got here is I took the ridership from Amtrak's FY23 ridership numbers station by station. They have not yet published the similar document for FY24, although the last one was dated March of 2024. So I'm guessing it's going to be out in the next few weeks or months, something like that. And then I took the 2020 census population of that metropolitan statistical area, right? So MSA is how the census defines metro areas. And so the cities, and this is kind of going from west to east in North Carolina, starting in Charlotte, ending in Raleigh, and then where each of the stations are, and then what metro area that's a part of, right? And so this is the ridership at each of those stations. Now, mind you, all of Ohio had 134,000 riders that year. And so we see there are, all three of the main stations exceeded Ohio's entire ridership numbers. But the reason I wanted to include the population is because just again, to show how much stronger the business case is in Ohio. Because when we look at this, I mean, Charlotte is a medium-sized city and the others are medium, small-sized cities. And again, this total population served is 5.6 million. So now I'm going to pop up the Ohio population. So this is the stations slash proposed stations. Some of these locations aren't confirmed if we move forward, but just the reminder that, we've got Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati, all with more than 2 million people in their metro areas. Dayton with 800,000. Springfield is evaluated as a separate metropolitan area, and so 130,000 people there, 130,000 people in the Mansfield area. And so when you put all that together, we've got 7.6 million people within roughly a 30-minute drive of an Ohio 3C and D station. So when we look at, hey, what's the business case for this service? Who's going to use it? Where are the people coming from? By comparing it to what we see in North Carolina, we can see that proven existing service that is continuing to getting investment is a good model for the potential here in Ohio. All right. And then a few other notes as we look at Ohio as a place. I did some digging. I remember I saw somewhere either Amtrak or the state of North Carolina was bragging about how many college students there are along that Piedmont corridor. And I was like, there's probably a lot on the Ohio 3C and D. So I did some digging and figured out that there are 285,000 college students at four-year institutions that are within a 30-minute drive of an Ohio 3C and D station, right? So, I mean, obviously, as you would expect, Columbus with Ohio State and all the other schools, Cincinnati with the University of Cincinnati. I'd say the one that maybe surprised me a little bit is Springfield. I mean, for those of you who know the map, so Springfield is this purple dot here, just kind of east of Dayton. Springfield is a separate metro area. Springfield actually has more than 17,000 college students, right? So you've got Wittenberg right in town, and then there are three smaller state universities that are relatively close to Springfield, so closer to Springfield than they are to Dayton. But of course, you've got a lot of schools around the big cities along that route. The station in Columbus would actually be under the convention center right downtown, so that the tracks go right into the convention center. And when that facility was built, they left enough space for platforms with the anticipation of it eventually being the train station. So, you know, the platforms would still need to be built, but a lot of times the most expensive part is just getting space for things and land acquisition. Everything that's necessary, you know, as far as placement and space available is ready to go in Columbus. You know, of course, here in Cleveland, you know, whether presumably it would continue to be on the lakefront, but even if some of us that are agitating for it get them to move it back to Tower City, either one is a short walk to the convention center here in downtown Cleveland. And then, at least in previous investigations of an Ohio 3C and D, you know, Amtrak would be very interested in having a station in Cleveland near Cleveland Hopkins Airport. So it would be kind of both the Cleveland Hopkins Airport station, but also like the suburban West Cleveland station. You know, so for people who don't want to go downtown to catch the train, they would have this new option by the airport. So I think in many ways there are a lot of similarities in terms of what service could be provided, the populations that could be provided, the types of cities that are being connected between the service in North Carolina and what we have here in the state of Ohio proposed around these 3C and D. And then another important comparison too is that politically, North Carolina is much more similar to Ohio than some of the other states that have stronger passenger rail service in the U.S. So I think as we continue to make our case to the leadership of the state of Ohio, we can refer to North Carolina as much more similar political climate to Ohio, again, than compared to maybe some other states with successful passenger rail programs like Illinois and California and New England. I don't think those are as likely to catch the attention of the leadership in Ohio today, whereas North Carolina is going to be much more similar in that and has enjoyed bipartisan support in North Carolina. And also Virginia has enjoyed strong bipartisan support for their passenger rail programs over time. So I suspect that that's going to be a stronger case as we continue to make the case in Columbus. So those are the comparisons that I wanted to draw here between, you know, the North Carolina service and what could potentially happen in Ohio. So I'm going to put it back on this slide because I think this is the one that kind of helps when we really see it in map form, see the states right next to each other, notice, you know, how many similarities there are in what we're talking about. And you know, so those are that was basically the content that I wanted to cover. So I think, you know, the next thing I just want to say, hey, what questions do you have or any other discussion? You know, I know there's some folks on the line that are very familiar with that and might have some points that they want to go add in. So I just want to open up the floor now and see what questions people have and where we go. And then I'm going to want to talk about, hey, you know, what do we want to do for some chapter events in the future? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
This is for Ken Sislak, actually. Is the NOACA people talking to the U.S. Congress about expanding the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad to downtown? I'd like to ask Ken Sislak that.
Answer to that question, Micah, has been yes, they are. In fact, the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad and the National Park Service are going down to Columbus to meet with state representatives next week. So
what day?
Tuesday next week.
And they're going to talk about the scenic railroad extension?
Yes.
That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we'll see how it goes. What, does anybody else have questions on kind of comparisons between North Carolina and Ohio? Yeah, Adam, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. Super cool presentation, great comparison. I'm really interest is really peaked. Just out of curiosity, did you look at anything about like drive time versus train time and like cost of like fares?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So one of the interesting things in North Carolina, part of the reason this service exists, I mean, that was like the original train line that connected things in North Carolina. The highway from Charlotte to Raleigh, you might look at this map and say, oh, there's probably a more direct way to get there. But actually the highway connection from Charlotte does kind of follow pretty much the same path of going up through Greensboro and Raleigh. So essentially what you have is, when they started, it was slower to take the train. Now on most of those sections, if you were going downtown to downtown, you'd probably be better off on the train. There's going to be
Wow.
pretty, number of sections that are running at 79 mile an hour. And then as they continue to make investments and increase the speeds, the train would be consistently faster. Right now, anytime you get traffic on that freeway, you're better off on the train. Okay. And then
Amazing.
you also asked about the fares. So that's a great question. Amtrak fares are often by mileage. So just to give a couple of comparisons, I don't know the North Carolina ones off the top of my head, but one of the examples we had included is if you were to go from Dayton to Cleveland, based on Amtrak fares on other state-supported routes, we're expecting that ticket would typically be like a $35 ticket from Dayton to Cleveland. And to give you another
Cool.
idea, today, as long as you're buying it in advance and there's a seat available, because sometimes it sells out. If you want to go from Toledo to Cleveland, it's a $16 ticket. The problem
Yeah.
is it's one station at 1:30 and the other station at 3:30, so that makes it a little bit tough. But it
Yeah,
scoots right
really great
along.
idea.
The Floridian, so what had been the capital, like that was from Chicago to Cleveland, scheduled at 6.5 hours, right? You got to be moving pretty good to beat that driving.
Yeah.
Great question. Did
Thanks,
you have
Brent.
another one in there, Adam?
No, that was it.
Okay,
Thank
awesome.
you.
Thank you for the question. Dan, yeah, go ahead with your question.
Hey, appreciate all the info today and just like all the advocacy that you guys have been up to. My question's really in relation to some of the discussions that came out of the state legislature there.
Mhm.
One of the points that they brought up, and well, a special kudos to Mitch because he was kind of bobbing and weaving very well in all the
Mhm.
questioning, but they brought up getting like a CPA to provide, essentially like an overview of the finances from some of these other rails. So I'm just
Mhm.
curious, like what your guys' reaction to that was, how feasible it is to get, an accountant's, review of those other systems, because it seems like that might really help us convince some of the naysayers.
Yeah, I mean, so thank you for the question. It might not, I think some people are just looking for an excuse to say no, but there are other people that are going to look at that as an economic impact. Essentially, what we as an organization have done is we sponsored a study to look into how other states with state-supported Amtrak service are paying for that service, right? So evaluating, hey, how is Missouri doing this? How is Michigan doing this? How is Minnesota doing this? So states that have state-supported service, where are they pulling funding from to pay for the operating subsidy? I guess one thing is with the new service that went to St. Paul's, they didn't need an operating subsidy because it's actually been running a net profit on the service, which is wonderful to see. But typically, state-supported service, it's going to cost more to run the train than fares are going to generate. So I think it's twofold. One is like, okay, so where does this funding come from? Like which types of, is it taxes? Is it fees? What other types of funding can we use to pay for that operating subsidy? And then two, and the thing we got to keep coming back to is like, hey, what is the economic impact of this? And so AAO had sponsored an economic impact analysis of that, and we've shared those results to help indicate, hey, this is the type of direct economic impact. And then the other point that we make too is that the secondary economic impacts are much more important. So direct economic impact would be the money spent building rails, building stations, the money spent on tickets, the money spent in the concession stand at the train station. The secondary economic impacts, which are going to be an order of magnitude larger, would be what is the increased property value around stations? What is the value of researchers at Case Western Reserve being easily connected to researchers at Ohio State? What is the value of being able to hop on a train to do business, right? Those are all in that secondary bucket. That's a much larger impact, and it's quite frankly the reason that we invest in any transportation project. So hopefully that gives you some ideas there. I think, Dan, was there another question in there?
I guess like if we've done these studies and we don't feel like that was convincing enough, like what would you say is the stance? Like that they're just to that point, they're just looking for a reason to say no, or do we feel like we can sway them by digging deeper into like specific finances
Yeah.
from other systems?
I think it's a good question. I think there are some that are persuadable. To be blunt, when we were down a couple of weeks ago, I know Ken experienced this. I experienced this. There were people that we got a really positive reaction from that we were not expecting a really positive reaction from between the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate. Now that's where we start. That's where we start when we continue working on those. That the study about how do other states pay for it. I want to emphasize, like, we have commissioned that. We have not published that yet. So I am expecting that will be made public here. And so that's kind of our next step of like, hey, you're asking us how to pay for this. Here's how other states that have these programs are paying for it. And I'm expecting that we're going to be releasing that report from the SIOTA analysis team here in the next couple of weeks. And that'll be what we continue to point to. I
Great.
think I saw, I thought I saw Dave Thomas. Did I see your hand a moment ago? If you can find your mute button, that's
you
always
did.
fun. Thank you.
Yeah. So kind of following up with the question that Adam asked, right? So for the Cleveland, like let's say Cleveland and Cincinnati, right? That's quite a drive. Right. And so just even if it's the same amount of time, I personally would still probably take that trip every time on the train. But to try to convince others to get on it, right, and understanding that there's always that issue with freight owned rail, right? Do we anticipate that timing being a little bit more advantageous towards trains? And if not, what are some of the ways that, you think that can be brought down a bit so that it can, kind of entice people to get out of a car?
A wonderful, wonderful question. Thank you for that. When we look at train, like one of the reasons I really like passenger rail is you can always invest a little bit more to get a little bit better service to drive more ridership. So one of the points that I try and make, so Senator Tom Patton from Strongsville, when he was, leading the transportation committee, he's like, hey, when we looked at this before, it was really slow. It's going to take forever to get to Columbus. I won't ride this. And so as I was making my case to legislatures, part of what I was doing is saying, hey, when you're driving I-71, which you do all the time, do you ever notice the person next to you on their cell phone or nodding off, or maybe they kind of look like they can't see all that well and probably shouldn't be driving? Wouldn't it be nice if they were not driving? Right. So rather than trying to convince that particular individual that they're the one, they're going to use the train, let's remind them like, hey, you're going to get these other drivers that you don't want to be competing with. Get them off the road. They're driving now because they don't have a choice. Give them a choice. If they need to get to Columbus today, they have to drive. So let's give them a choice, right? If Mike's going from Canton to Columbus and he's not in a hurry, right? He takes the train. That's one less car competing with the driver. So I really try and make that case. So we kind of, even for a person that's never going to ride this train or thinks they're never going to ride the train, that they've got a reason to support it. Let's get the other people off the road, less competition. So that's where I start. And then the other point I try and make is I just like, look, a service does not have to be perfect for every trip to be useful for many trips, right? So even if it's not perfect for you on day one, there are going to be other people that are going to be riding this, right? The city of Cleveland, 24% of households do not have access to a car, and there's no households that 25%, right? And so that's a chunk of people. When we look at Americans nationwide, 10% of American adults never or rarely drive. In other words, less than once a month. And because of how we've got everything set up, they're trapped in our homes. One of the testimonials we included was a grandmother in Dayton whose grandkids live in Cleveland. She's like, I just want to go see my grandkids. I'm not really comfortable driving on the highway, not comfortable driving through Columbus, not comfortable driving in Cleveland. Give me a choice. I will ride this train. So that's one of the points that we make. And then once you get started, you put more money and you can get faster times and more frequency. Yeah, go ahead with your follow, Dave.
Yeah, no. I was just gonna say those are great points, right? And like I said, I would take. So I'm down in Columbus, a couple
Mhm.
times a month for work, right? So I would probably take that most of the time anyway. But your point about bringing people who aren't the person you're talking to out of the car, right? I love that because they, you hear that justification all the time with like bike advocacy too, right? It's like,
Mhm,
hey,
mhm.
maybe you love to ride drive your car. That's fine, but wouldn't you like it if all the other people who you don't think should be on the road, have other options so that they're not on the road, it's less traffic, it's safer. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Doesn't have to be perfect for every trip to be useful for lots of trips. Dan, did I see you pop your hand up? And then I'll get back to you, Alex.
Nope.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, Alex, go ahead. Oops, you got muted there. Alex, you muted. I'll hit this button that says ask to unmute. Well, while he's working on that, any other? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Is the downtown station going to be at the lakefront or at Tower City?
So that's a great question. I would say that as far as the city is concerned today, it would be at the lakefront. And even if there was some hope of returning trains to Tower City at some point in the future,
Probably would be
probably
the scenic
initially.
railroad, probably.
Well, that has its own set of challenges, but I would say in the near term, if this happens, we should expect that it'll be the lakefront. The city continues to pursue its efforts to get a land bridge. The land bridge is intended to be constructed in such a way that a multimodal station could be part
But you got
of
that
that.
funding freeze.
And I mean those are all pieces of it. To get the passenger rail service that we deserve, either the lakefront or terminal tower would require substantial amounts of investment. And so some of us have advocated of like, hey, let's at least get a true feasibility study on that so we can identify all of the engineering things, because there are pretty expensive aspects about using the lakefront site as well if you're trying to increase the number of trains there. Yeah, Paul, go ahead.
I was watching the WOSU's weekly reporter roundtable the other day on all sides, and
Mhm.
talking about the transportation budget, and it was briefly mentioned that the Senate had removed rejoining the Midwest Compact. Is that true?
So the House included it and the Senate took it out. And my understanding is that they are currently in conference to nail things out. So I don't know where that's going to end in the transportation budget. I saw one place was reporting it had passed, but my understanding is they still have to go through conference to work out the differences. So we'll see how that plays out. We think there are potentially opportunities to include that funding in the general budget if it doesn't get into the transportation budget. So that's our strategy.
From my listening to that discussion, the reporters discussing it made it sound like it was a little I don't know, a little special interest, or not a serious part of the thing. It isn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's $25,000. It is peanuts in the Ohio transportation budget. So we'll see. I don't know. Ken, did you have a comment on that or a question on something else?
No, that's fine.
Oh, no, yeah, Ken put his hand up.
Yeah, my question is, who in the Senate took it out?
I don't know, Ken, if you had a chance to watch so there was the transportation budget hearing last Friday. Both John and Mitch testified there. It was not at all like the House transportation budget had gone. There were a lot of challenging questions. So it was I mean, with Senator Patton leading that committee, but also the senator from Lancaster was pushing back pretty hard. The senator from Marietta was pushing back pretty hard. So I don't know that we know who takes it out. The Senate Transportation Committee officially did. But I mean, it was one
And
of
that
those
would be the,
individuals, I'm pretty
the
sure.
chairman's, I think that's the chairman's prerogative. And
Yeah,
I would
that's my guess too.
suspect Patton did it because he's been anti-rail all his life.
Yep, that would be my guess as well. So we'll keep working on it. And sorry, Alex, we can't hear you. Did anybody else have any questions though while we're still in line and we kind of okay. Well, let me sorry, was that a okay, so let me change gears just a minute. I guess I can stop man. You know, I almost hit end there when I meant to just hit stop sharing, but we'll get this back so we're seeing each other seeing each other's faces through the joys of Zoom. So I know a number of you have participated in our Northeast chapter events and our statewide events. So I want to make sure everybody is aware that our statewide meetings are the second Saturday of each month. That's a Zoom meeting that you see on you can log in for that and get a summary of our state topics. We have launched a YouTube channel now, so we are recording those statewide meetings and posting them to the YouTube channel. So if there's a statewide meeting and they went back, all the ones that we have recorded have been posted now. So go ahead and look us up on YouTube if you want to see some of those old ones. The most recent one, we talk about the Advocacy Day that that Ken and I got to participate in with a number of other folks. That event was very well supported, very well received. We had a lot of good support from the communities along the way, the regional planning organizations and everything else. So that was a really good day to be a part of, and I'd encourage you to go check that out and read about it on the webpage. As a chapter here, the cadence that I'm working on is essentially having a Zoom meeting a quarterly Zoom meeting. So every 3 months have a Zoom meeting and then have like an in-person happy hour. And so try and do that about monthly or, so kind of the next month. And then having, guest speakers and things like that. So some of you were able to come in. We had Annie Pease, who is Cuyahoga County's transportation leader, come in and present to us last month. So typically those will be at a library. So, I was just looking at scheduling the next one. It'll probably be, tail end of April, maybe the beginning of May. And I was thinking a happy hour probably for a city brewery, despite leaving us a little bit stranded last time, is usually a good place for those events. So just to kind of give you a preview of what I'm thinking to do next, but also see if anybody had any things that they wanted to throw out as potential chapter meeting events. We went to the Trolley Museum a couple of years ago. Yeah, go ahead, Mike. Were you saying something? Oh, maybe not. Yeah, so we got a chance to go to the Trolley Museum in Southwest Medina County a couple of years ago. That was a nice event. Kind of get to see, a lot of the old units. We had the RTA Rail Maintenance Facility. I guess it's a little closer to a year and a half ago. They have invited us to come back once the new trains start coming in. So those are under construction. I don't think they're going to get any of those yet this year. I think they're going to start testing on them next year. So, looking forward to that. But, if there's other ideas or suggestions that you think would make a good chapter meeting, I would welcome them. Yeah, Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. That sounds like a great plan. I'm excited. I was just thinking, like, man, any kind of like advocacy, any way I can speak up and organize and get more people on our side. Like I'm all about. So yeah, even if those meetings, incorporate some of that. I was also thinking about Clevelanders for Public Transit. Like they might be good people to bring in to like you mentioned, a guest speaker to maybe collab with a little bit.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. I'm friends with Joe Schwarten, and I like that idea. We've talked about, hey, what is there anything that makes sense for collaboration efforts? So I like that. I like that idea as well. So, well, like I said, if you have other thoughts about what might make for a good chapter activity, I'd love to hear them. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, two thoughts, and being kind of new to the to AAO. Maybe you guys do this all the time, but it's far off in the future, but CVNP obviously is like a fun thing to do in the winter. It could be a fun thing for us as a sort of outing. I've actually never been on it, but I've seen it go by, you know. I always
Mhm.
see the waterfall in the winter when it's frozen. But yeah, just an idea there. And then also our North Coast, excuse me, our North Coast project with the city of Cleveland, we're doing a near-term park, like pop-up park right on the lakefront there. You'll have a bunch of representatives from the city there. And you know, we've got a food and beverage vendor and all that sort of
Mhm.
thing. So that's going to kick off this summer. So if we ever wanted to have an interesting location down at the lake this year, would work.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Another thing I've been trying to get more information on is just like, hey, you know, I know there are discussions on Elyria Station. I'm trying to figure out if there's anybody that's like, hey, this is, you know, what's happening, or this is what we're asking for funding for, things like that. I haven't gotten much traction on that one yet. So, but I mean, as far as the, you know, the CVSR, I'm sure Ken would love to hear that. I mean, for anybody, especially for new folks that are joining us. So Ken Sislak, who's on the line and had answered a couple of questions. He's on the board of the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad and has been a long time part of that organization as well.
And we have another new member on the board, John Pursuit.
Oh, did John join? Wonderful. Yeah, and then so you kind of John's claim to fame is if you've ridden the Rapid in Cleveland, you've ridden John's work because he wrote all the original specs for the trains that we're using in the city of Cleveland. So he's the guy for that. So I'm just so grateful that John's able to join us and participate, you know, from Oberlin in these events. So thank you, John, for being here. Good. Well, I think it seems like a natural breaking point. I'll probably hang around for a couple minutes here in case anybody has any other questions. But thank you very much for spending a portion of your evening with us. You know, really appreciate having you here, and hope to see you at future events. So thank you so much for your time. And again, go check out the All Aboard Ohio webpage. Look at some of the future events, especially if these Zoom events are more comfortable for you. Second Saturday of the month, we have these meetings every week.
Actually, I do have a question.
Go ahead, Alex.
Speaking of passenger railroad expansion in the 3C&D, I don't want to talk about this, but there's a governor's race, and it could decide whether we have passenger rail in the state. Vivek Ramaswamy's running for governor, and he opposed the California high-speed rail.
I mean, there are lots of different projects and a lot of different things happening. So yes, elections are going to matter into whether this happens. And as rail advocates, I encourage you to ask candidates what their position on rail is. And then you try and figure out, hey, what's grandstanding versus what's real policy decisions, you know, and go from there. So
yes,
yeah.
I'm very concerned.
Mm-hmm.
It could have, I'm fearing that I'm very much concerned we're going to have another Kasich-like moment where he shut down the project before.
I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what the future holds. So, but yeah, like I said,